Okay, Cyrene's kit is out, and we are just going to dive straight into what she does and my first impressions on her, whether she's strong, or weak, or restrictive, or whatnot. First things first, her ultimate requires special energy, similarly to Acheron, Feixiao, or Finon. It requires 24 stacks of recollection, which she gets within her kit. Her basic attack is a regular single target ice attack that scales on HP, and it gives her 1 stack of recollection. Her skill deploys a zone similar to Triby's zone, and essentially grants the entire team 20% true damage on every attack that they do. It also gives her 3 stacks of recollection for her ultimate. These are the only things Cyrene is able to do when she doesn't have her ultimate ready. She needs to build up all 24 stacks of her ultimate in order to do anything else. Therefore, she's generally just going to be spamming her skill to try and get as many stacks for her ultimate as possible. Luckily, there are other ways to get recollection stacks for her ultimate in her talent. Her talent has a lot of confusing phrasing, but basically, at the start of battle, or whenever Cyrene takes action, she gives all allies a stack of future. When allies with a stack of future take action, they give Cyrene 1 stack of recollection for her ultimate, while consuming the stack of future. What this essentially means is that every ally can only give 1 stack for Cyrene's ultimate every time they take action, and then Cyrene will need to take action in order to allow them to give another stack for her ultimate again. This means that back-to-back Triby follow-up attacks will still only give 1 stack for Cyrene's ultimate, since Triby can only give 1 stack until Cyrene takes action and allows Triby to give her another stack again. Therefore, frequently attacking characters aren't as good as you might think for stacking Cyrene's ultimate, since there's a limit on how fast she can charge it, with the exception of Remembrance characters. I know we haven't talked at all about what her ultimate or Membrite do yet, which are the bread and butter of her kit, but that's because stacking her ultimate is so important. So I really want to make sure you understand how she achieves this first before we get into the really confusing stuff. Seriously, there is so much going on in her kit. So jumping down to Cyrene's bonus abilities, ally Membrites are unable to lose stacks of future, which is the mechanic that was necessary for allies to give her stacks for her ultimate when they take action. In other words, Membrites will always give her stacks for her ultimate, even if Cyrene hasn't taken action yet to refresh their ability to give stacks. So fast-moving Membrites are the best at stacking her ultimate. Additionally, Cyrene starts the battle with a certain amount of stacks for her ultimate, depending on the amount of Chrysos Heirs on the team. This is the start of a trend you're going to see with her kit, where much of her kit is specifically dedicated to the Chrysos Heirs, even going so far as to have the Chrysos Heirs' names written in her kit. But we'll get to that later. The beginning stacks that she gets from this bonus ability honestly isn't a crazy amount. It's not even half of her ultimate's total cost, but at least it's something. And it really incentivizes her to be teamed up with as many Chrysos Heirs as possible. And while we're here, we might as well touch on her third bonus ability, which essentially incentivizes her to build as much speed as possible to buff her teammates' damage, as well as her own ice res pen. She's very similar to Hyacine in that she wants to reach upwards of 200 speed. Now, let's finally touch on her ultimate. Once she gets 24 stacks, Cyrene's ultimate becomes usable, and it only consumes 12 stacks, so she'll still have 12 stacks left over after using her ultimate, which is important for later. Upon using her ultimate, she does a few things. First off, she activates all allies' ultimates, just straight up fully fills them up to 100% so they can instantly be used. Then, she enters her enhanced state, enabling her to use her enhanced basic attack and increasing her own crit rate by 50%. Her enhanced basic attack essentially just does AoE ice damage, scaling off of her HP. She is no longer able to use her skill in this enhanced state, but that's not an issue since her ultimate also deploys the same zone from her skill with no turn limit. Lastly, this ultimate finally summons her Membrite and allows her Membrite to immediately take action. So this is quite the crazy ultimate, right? It's doing a lot, namely in filling up the entire team's ultimates by 100%. However, this is where the caveat comes in. Cyrene's ultimate can only be used 1 time per battle. Yep, you heard me right. Everything we just described can only happen 1 time for an entire fight. It is a very powerful ultimate, so it makes sense to some degree, but it's the first ultimate in the entire game that literally has a limit to how many times it can be used in battle. So what happens after Cyrene uses this ultimate? Does she just no longer have an ultimate? Well, no. Her ultimate gets replaced with a new skill. This skill requires 12 stacks of recollection, just like her ultimate, and it takes over her ultimate bar icon, so it essentially acts as a second mini ultimate for Cyrene. This second ultimate causes her Membrite to take action, and that's it. So obviously, it's much less impressive than her actual initial ultimate, but it is important to note that she's able to use it in between characters' turns, just like other ultimates. It's also important to note that while her ultimate requires 24 recollection stacks to activate, it only consumes 12 stacks upon use, and then her smaller ultimate also requires 12 stacks upon use. So since her initial ultimate summons her Membrite and lets it take action, and then she still has 12 leftover stacks that she can immediately use to make her Membrite take action again, she can essentially give her Membrite 2 immediate turns. But what does her Membrite do with these turns? Well, first of all, it should be noted that Cyrene doesn't really have a visual summon. She is basically her own Membrite, so when her Membrite takes action, it basically just looks like she's taking action again. Makes you wonder why she's even Remembrance Path and not Harmony Path when her Membrite actions are actually just herself, but it is what it is. I understand it's for lore reasons, but still. So, her Membrite can choose between 2 different actions. It can either attack the enemy for AoE ice damage, or it can choose to use its buffing skill. And this is where things get really complicated for Cyrene, so hold on to your seatbelts as I walk you through this. Cyrene's buffing skill does different things depending on if she's buffing a Chrysos Heir or not. not. And then it does different things depending on which Chrysos Heir she's buffing. So let's walk through them. First off, if she isn't buffing a Chrysos Heir, it just gives the character an underwhelming 40% damage buff for 2 turns only. In other words, Cyrene is not even close to giving her maximum value if she's being used in teams that don't center around one of the Chrysos Heirs. It's very restricting, I know, but that's just how her kit has been designed. Now, if she is buffing a Chrysos Heir, she gives a very specific buff based on who it is. So let's go through each Chrysos Heir. First off, Remembrance Trailblazer, since they still count as a Chrysos Heir. If Cyrene selects the Remembrance Trailblazer to receive her buff, she increases their attack by a percentage of Cyrene's HP, and she increases their crit rate by a percentage of Cyrene's crit rate. It should be noted that Remembrance Trailblazer gets a 100% crit rate on their ult, but not on their basic attacks. And speaking of basic attacks, Remembrance Trailblazer is actually getting a new enhanced basic attack in patch 3.7 that is very similar to Aglaya's basic attack, where Remembrance Trailblazer and Mem both attack the enemy at the same time in a joint attack. After Remembrance Trailblazer uses this new enhanced basic attack, Cyrene also unleashes her offensive Membrite skill that deals AoE ice damage to all enemies. Clearly, her buff for Remembrance Trailblazer is meant to help them play as a DPS, which is really weird, since most of us mainly think of Remembrance Trailblazer as a support. Next up is Aglaya. If Cyrene chooses Aglaya to receive her buff, she gives Aglaya a stack of something called Romantic. A very creative name. Aglaya's speed boost automatically gets stacked to full, and when she uses her next enhanced basic attack, she consumes the Romantic stack that Cyrene gave her in order to instantly gain 70 energy. Additionally, Aglaya's damage will be increased by 72%, and she and Garment Maker ignore a whopping 36% of all enemies' defense as long as Aglaya never exits her enhanced state. For Tribby, Cyrene mainly buffs her personal damage, allowing Tribby to ignore 12% of enemies' defense while also causing Tribby's follow-up attacks to deal 1 extra instance of the additional damage from her ultimate zone effect. This effect on Tribby is permanent, meaning Cyrene doesn't need to keep reapplying this buff to Tribby to activate it. As soon as Tribby receives this buff once, she'll have it for the rest of the battle, which is important to note because, remember, Cyrene instantly gets 2 usages of her Membrite skill since it costs 12 recollection stacks, and she can only ult when she has 24 anyway, meaning she can use one of her Membrite skill buffs on Tribby and then immediately use the other one on the main DPS. For Mighty, she allows him to instantly use his Godslayer Be God at the cost of no charge, and she increases the crit damage of this particular attack by 60%. If he's not in the Vendetta state, then she instead action advances him by 100%. But let's be honest, your Mighty should always be in the Vendetta state. This is a fairly straightforward buff that mainly just gives Mighty some instantaneous front-loaded damage, though it is just a one-time thing, meaning if you want Cyrene's buff to be doing anything for Mighty, you'll need to build up 12 more stacks of recollection again so she can utilize her Membrite skill on Mighty again. For Casterus, Cyrene's buff applies a permanent buff to Casterus, where Casterus's Nubud charges for her ultimate can now overcap by up to 200%. However, this doesn't mean Casterus can hold the excess Nubud in order to do a back-to-back ultimate, because when she activates her ultimate, she still consumes all of it, even the Nubud that was over 100%. For every excess percent of Nubud she consumed, she increases the damage multiplier of the dragon's exiting attack when it explodes, which is further increased when there are only 2 enemy targets on the field or lower. So it mainly serves to increase Casterus's damage for any overflow stacks she ends up getting, and doesn't actually speed up her ultimate rotation for her next ultimate, since she can't keep the overstacked Nubud charges, meaning it's not as crazy as it sounds, and is mostly just a damage buff for Cass, not an ultimate stacking buff. For Anaxa, the buff is a one-time use thing. First off, it regenerates 1 skill point for the team, and instantly action advances Anaxa by 100%. She then increases Anaxa's skill damage and attack, and when Anaxa uses his skill, the number of bounces increases by 3. This lasts for 1 whole turn, meaning he can make use of this for every skill usage when paired with Ceredra, which is really strong. However, since it only lasts 1 turn, Cyrene will need to build up 12 recollection stacks to cast her Membrite skill on Anaxa again to activate this effect again. For Hyacinth, she doesn't even need to be targeted by Cyrene's buff, meaning Cyrene can target someone else on the team, and Hyacinth will still get the buff. Hyacinth's buff essentially just increases her healing. When the buff is used to select Hyacinth, it just gives Hyacinth 24 energy. Not the craziest buffs in the world, but they're really nice when you take into account that Cyrene doesn't even need to target Hyacinth to give her the healing buff, which is obviously really good in Casterus teams. For Cypher, Cyrene's buff increases Cypher's own damage, which is nothing crazy since Cypher's personal damage is nothing crazy, but she then also decreases the defense of the enemy marked as Cypher's patron, while also decreasing the defense of all other enemies by a smaller amount, further adding onto Cypher's ability to debuff enemies. And then we have Finon. First off, she increases Finon's crit rate by 16%, presumably to make up for losing Sunday if you end up losing Sunday. Then, when Finon uses all of his turns inside of his ultimate, he will not exit his ultimate. His ultimate's finishing move will still activate, but instead of exiting his ultimate, Finon will instead stay in his ultimate, and all of his turns will instead get refreshed, which is a pretty crazy change in playstyle for Finon. Finon will still exit his ultimate if he dies in it though. And to add onto the survival pressure, Cyrene makes Finon consume his HP at the start of every turn. Now, Finon's self-healing does still still offset this, so his HP is still net positive, but against really hard-hitting enemies, such as in Anomaly Arbitration, you're still going to have to be careful if you're going to try to run Sustainless, given that Cyrene makes it even harder. Lastly, after each of Finon's attacks, he now deals an additional 5 instances of fire damage to random enemies. Don't ask me why it's fire damage. Cyrene is ice, Finon is physical, but the damage is fire. I understand they're trying to do a nod to the lore because it's core flames. Core flames are fire themed, wow, but it's just weird. I don't know. Sure, Finon does fire damage now. Good lord, we've gone through so many of them, and there's still so much more to go through. This character just has way too many things in her kit. No wonder she has a whole separate UI in-game dedicated to all of these different buffs. For Heislens, her buff gives Heislens 60 energy, so now it makes sense why Heislens has a bit of an awkward energy rotation without spamming skill. Additionally, Heislens gets 100% increased damage, and her basic attack and skill can now proc DOTs on the enemy, albeit the multiplier of this DOT proc isn't as high as Kafka's, nor will it be as frequently as Kafka's, so don't go thinking Kafka is completely replaced for DOT teams just yet. But it is admittedly very nice for Heislens to feel a little more self-sufficient with Cyrene's buffs. And then there's Cyrene. We don't talk about Cyrene, but if we have to talk about Cyrene, using Cyrene's buff on Cyrene makes the target affected by her military merit gain 30% crit damage. Yeah, that's it. The buff technically isn't even on Cyrene, it's on the target affected by Cyrene's skill. Additionally, after Cyrene's target uses her double skill, Cyrene immediately gains 1 charge of military merit to start stacking up towards her next double skill. But like, it's only 1 stack. It's nothing too crazy. Cyrene getting the short end of the stick as per usual. For Evernight, Cyrene gives her a permanent buff, increasing the damage of Evie's enhanced Membrite skill while also giving 1 extra stack of Memoria each time Evernight uses her skill or ultimate, which essentially translates to higher multipliers for Evie, which is nice. For Danheng Permancer Terai, he has a similar case to Hyacine, where he actually doesn't need to be targeted by her to receive the first part of his buff, meaning Cyrene can select other teammates for her buffs, and Danheng will still get his buff. This is probably because both he and Hyacine are sustains, so they allowed them to get buffs without needing to be the target. Cyrene increases the damage dealt by Danheng's bondmate by 16%, and she makes the next 3 instances of the Soul Dragon's attacks deal additional damage equal to the bondmate's shield effect, most likely still scaling off of the bondmate's stats. Then, if she does end up selecting Danheng as the target for her buff, she instantly action advances the Soul Dragon and allows it to attack even if it wasn't under the enhanced state of Danheng's ultimate, and the shield it provides is even increased by 150%. So those are all of her buffs to the different Chrysos heirs. If you want me to briefly give my thoughts on which heirs are benefiting the most from her, Finon probably has the craziest buff, although he does run into some issues with slotting Cyrene on his teams. Casterus, Hyacine, and Evernight benefit a lot from Cyrene in general because she's a remembrance character, so having a Membrite inherently synergizes with their kits, and they're also the best at charging Cyrene's ultimate due to Cyrene also synergizing with Membrites. But their specific buffs are nothing too crazy to balance out the fact that they already synergize with her at a baseline. Aglaya's buff is also pretty insane, as does Anaxa's when it lines up with Cyrene's double skill. Cypher's brings some nice extra dev shred. Other than that, the others don't seem like the craziest thing in the world. Additionally, after Cyrene has gained recollection stacks from each teammate, she enhances her Membrite's attacking skill to deal 1 additional instance of damage to a random enemy, which is nice for her personal damage, I guess. Lastly, for her Membrite talents. Her Membrite has no speed and doesn't appear on the action order. So as we covered earlier, the only way for it to even take turns is by using her mini ultimate that replaces her first ultimate after its initial use, at the cost of 12 recollection stacks. Obviously, when you use this mini ultimate, you can choose to have the Membrite use its AoE attack or its support buff with the Chrysos heirs, as we already covered. Despite her Membrite basically not existing, it does have its own HP bar, just so casters can drain HP from it, I guess. And its HP is equal to Cyrene's HP, even giving them both an HP increase when the Membrite is on the field. Lastly, when Cyrene summons her Membrite, which is only via her initial ultimate, it cleanses the entire team of all crowd control effects, which is neat. Okay, holy moly, we finally covered what her entire kit does. Now let's briefly talk about her early Eidolons, as well as what I think about her current kit design and direction. Mostly, I just want to touch on her early Eidolons. While her E1 is mostly just a personal damage increase, her E2 is pretty huge for her ramp up time. It lets her start the battle with 12 extra stacks for her ultimate, while also increasing her true damage buff. Speeding up her ramp up time is a huge deal for Cyrene. It may not be super obvious just from discussing her kit, but Cyrene has a pretty significant ramp up time issue. 24 stacks for her ultimate is a lot, and oftentimes you have to spend an entire cycle just building up her ultimate depending on the team. There are even situations where you're doing weird things, like using RMC's action advance on Cyrene, even though it robs your DPS of the true damage buff, just to try and give Cyrene more turns to spam her skill to desperately try and get enough stacks for her ultimate. I understand that her ultimate is very strong, but to me, the ramp up time just feels very clunky. Now, once you do get her ultimate, things get a lot smoother, and she feels a lot better to play. But for me, it's not a matter of her feeling weak, and more a matter of her gameplay just not feeling fun or fulfilling, being forced to spend the entire first cycle spamming her skill through any means necessary to try and stack her ultimate. It's similar to when Robin released, and you had to use strategies like Bronya action advancing Robin to play around her energy issues. Or for those of you who play Genshin Impact, it feels like funneling energy to Shang Lang. Sure, it's optimal, and the result is very strong, strong, but it just doesn't feel very fun. This is one aspect of her that I very much expect to change though. Keep in mind, this is only version 1 of the beta. And to briefly touch on her light cone, it essentially gives her 18% speed, and then it applies a vulnerability debuff to the enemy when her Membrite uses an ability on an ally, and it gives a crit damage buff to the team when her Membrite uses an ability on an enemy. So she has to use both Membrite skills to get both buffs, and once she has both buffs, she essentially doubles the number of the buffs. I know the wording is a little confusing, but it essentially just means it makes the vulnerability debuff 20% instead of 10%, and it makes the crit damage buff 32% instead of 16%. But the other aspect of her that I want to give my first impressions on, and the aspect of her that I don't expect to change, is the way she's been designed for the Chrysos Heirs, and only the Chrysos Heirs. Cyrene has by far the most restrictive kit in the entire game. The first character to literally say the name of other characters in her kit in order to give specific buffs to them and them alone. Sure, she technically fits in multiple teams because the Chrysos Heirs have multiple teams, but that doesn't make her kit design less limiting. Think of it like this. How many new characters is she going to work with in the future? So much of her kit is dedicated to only functioning with specific Chrysos Heirs, meaning future characters won't even get anything out of her main utility. This means her only use case is to allow the Chrysos Heirs to remain relevant for a little longer, and then even then, she works better with some Chrysos Heirs than others. Now, with all that said, I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world, so long as Cyrene is an outlier. My fear with the direction of Cyrene's kit is that this is the direction they're going to take the game in general. If we start getting more and more characters who specifically name each other in their kits, Honkai Star Rail could very well be moving in a very bad direction in terms of game balance. Sure, some characters already rely on others to unlock mechanics for them, such as Jingyuan and Sunday, or break teams needing their super break supports. But I don't think I need to explain why it's drastically more limiting in design to start naming specific characters in a kit. Again, this is mostly a concern for the future, and it's too early to say whether or not this is the direction they're going to take in the future, but it's something I wanted to mention since it feels like Cyrene's kit design could really open the floodgates. In general, I think Cyrene is a strong character for most of the Chrysos Heirs, but the fact that she benefits some more than others is very sad if you're one of the Chrysos Heirs who isn't benefiting as much from her. In terms of playstyle, her ramp up time genuinely feels awful and unfun to play, but once you do have her ramped up, then she actually does feel fun to play, especially with the way you can cast 2 Chrysos Heir buffs back to back when she first activates her ultimate, and then having the ability to choose between adding more buffs or using her AoE attack afterwards is fun as well. And then, of course, I think Cyrene has the most gorgeous animations in the game, and that's also part of what adds to her fun factor. Similarly to Casters and Finon, you can tell that she got all of the animation budget. Due to all these reasons, I'm still excited for Cyrene, and I think her beta is going to be tons of fun to cover, but I'm also cautious about several things in her kit, and I'll have to see how Hoyo ends up handling those things moving forward. But how do you feel about the resident main female protagonist of Emphorius? Do you like the fact that she's dedicated to the Chrysos Heirs, or would you have preferred her kit to be more universal? Does her playstyle sound fun to you, or do you have doubts about her ramp-up time as well? Let me know in the comments below. Given how much hype is going into this character, I would love to keep discussing her with all of you. If you found the video helpful or enjoyable at all, be sure to leave a like, and consider subscribing if you want more content like this. There is so much more Cyrene content on the way, including her best synergies, as well as the best way to speedtune her in Finon teams, so keep an eye out for that. The Danheng PT guide is also on the way, so that'll definitely be coming before the free copy is given out. Thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see how future beta versions shake up this incredibly hyped up character. But for now, until next time!